The world remembers kings, conquerors, and empires, but heaven remembers men and women who walked by faith. After the apostles of the Lamb, God never stopped raising witnesses. They preached when it was illegal. They believed when it was dangerous. They endured when it cost them everything. This is heroes of faith, the true stories of believers whose lives proved that God is real. His power is timeless, and faith still changes the world. Kindly like, share, and subscribe, and let their faith strengthen you.
The spotted man grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the floor. Before anyone could speak, the small cord was out, the instrument of torture, and it was already biting into his wrists, pulled tight enough to cut off the blood, tight enough to make a grown man gasp. His wife screamed and threw herself at the man, offering silver, offering anything. The spotted man shoved her back and dragged her husband through the door. Outside, the whole neighborhood had gathered. Masons dropped their tools. Children screamed. The servants stood frozen in horror. And Adoniram Judson, missionary, linguist, servant of God, was hauled through the dusty streets of Ava with his arms wrenched behind his back, the cords drawing tighter with every step, headed for a place they called the death prison. He did not know if he would live to see morning. His wife ran after him as far as she could, watching the spotted executioner tighten the ropes once more until her husband's breathing was almost stopped. Then the prison door slammed shut. She stood alone in the street with nothing. No husband, no protection, no power, no allies. Only God. And the question that has echoed through every great life of faith, is he enough? This is the story of Adoniram Judson, the first Protestant missionary to Burma. The man who gave 37 years of his life to a people who had never heard the gospel, who suffered things that would have broken any ordinary human being, and who, in the end, left behind something that still stands to this day. This is his story. And before it's over, I promise you, you will never think about consecration the same way again. He was born on August 9, 1788, in Maiden, Massachusetts, the eldest son of a Congregationalist minister named Adoniram Judson Sr. From his very first days, there was something different about this boy. He learned to read at the age of 3. His mother taught him while his father was away on a journey, wanting to surprise him. When the elder Judson returned home, his 3-year-old son greeted him by reading aloud an entire chapter from the Bible. Even as a small child, his favorite hymn was the one that began, "Go preach my gospel, saith the Lord." By the time he was 7, he was conducting church in the neighborhood, gathering the other children together and preaching to them. By 10, he had gained a reputation for brilliance in mathematics, solving problems that baffled grown men. By 14, the family had moved to Plymouth, and by 19, just 19 years old, he graduated as valedictorian of Brown University, despite missing 6 weeks of his senior year to teach school. His father believed he was destined for greatness. His mother believed it too. And Adoniram himself burned with ambitions so fierce it frightened him. He wanted to be the greatest man America had ever produced. He wanted fame. He wanted glory. He wanted his name written in the stars. But a shadow was coming. During his years at college, French infidelity was sweeping through the educated classes of America like a flood. The young men of the best universities were reading Voltaire, mocking Christianity, and calling themselves freethinkers. And Adoniram Judson, brilliant, hungry for intellectual respect, did not escape. In the class above him was a young man named E, amiable, gifted, witty, and a confirmed deist. A strong friendship formed between the two. And before long, Judson had adopted the same infidel positions, at least outwardly. When he graduated and opened his own private academy in Plymouth, he concealed his religious doubts from his father, who was a minister. He tried to hide the emptiness, but it gnawed at him. Then came a journey that would change everything. After closing his school, Judson set out on a tour through the northern states. He rode alone, seeing the new republic, watching the Hudson River from Fulton's steamboat, exploring New York. One night, he stopped at a country inn. The landlord, as he showed him to his room, mentioned almost casually, I've put you next to a young man who is very ill. Probably dying. I hope it won't trouble you." Judson said it would not trouble him at all. But the night was unlike any he had known. Through the thin wall, he heard sounds, the movement of watchers, occasional groans from the sick man. And lying there in the darkness, his infidel philosophy seemed suddenly thin and hollow. Was the dying man prepared? Was he a freethinker like Judson's friend E, terrified now at the edge of the unknown? Or was he a Christian, going home to God with peace? The thoughts would not leave him. He told himself it was weakness, superstition, that his brilliant friend would laugh at him for such boyishness. But the night stretched on. In the morning he found the landlord. The sick man had died. "Do you know who he was?" Judson asked. "Yes," the landlord said. A young man from Providence College. Name was E. The name hit Judson like a thunderbolt. His brilliant, witty, philosophically certain friend, the very man who had introduced him to infidelity, had died in the next room while Judson lay sleepless with the question of eternity. The words rang in his mind for hours. He could not think. He turned his horse around and rode for Plymouth without completing the journey. He arrived September 22, 1808. That October, he entered the theological institution at Andover, not yet a believer, admitted only by special favor of the faculty. But God had already begun his work. On December 2, 1808, Adoniram Judson made a solemn dedication of himself to God. And on May 28, 1809, at 21 years old, he joined the church in Plymouth. The conversion was complete. And almost immediately, it burned in a new direction. In September of 1809, at Andover Seminary, a small book fell into his hands, a sermon by Dr. Claudius Buchanan, an English chaplain to the East India Company, titled *The Star in the East*. It described the progress of the gospel in Asia, and the desperate need of millions who had never heard the name of Christ. "For some days," Judson wrote years later, "I was unable to attend to the studies of my class. I spent my time wondering at my past stupidity, depicting the most romantic scenes in missionary life, and roving about the college rooms declaiming on the subject of missions." But the excitement faded. The vision remained, sharper, more sober. He began to pray. And one afternoon, he walked alone into the woods behind the college. In that solitude, wrestling with his soul, the great command of Christ came to him with sudden clarity: "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." It was presented to my mind with such clearness and power, he would say, that I came to a full decision, and though great difficulties appeared in my way, resolved to obey the command at all events. There were other young men God had been preparing. At Williams College, a group of students had gathered regularly beneath a haystack to pray for the heathen world. Samuel Mills, James Richards, Luther Rice, Gordon Hall, they all arrived at Andover. And together, these young men began to pray and plan and dream of carrying the gospel to Asia. The problem was there was no foreign missionary society in America at all. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of American Christianity. On June 27, 1810, Judson and his fellow students laid a petition before the General Association of Ministers in Massachusetts, asking for advice and support. The association voted to form a new body, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions the very first American Foreign Missionary Society. It was born from the prayers and surrender of a handful of young men who simply refused to let the world perish without the gospel. Adoniram Judson was 21 years old. But the cost was already mounting. The young man who had been offered the largest church in Boston, who had turned down a prestigious tutorship at Brown University, now looked his family in the face. His father's hopes for a great son in ministry at home shattered. His mother and sister wept. He did not waver. And then, there was Anne. He had met her at Bradford, Massachusetts, in June of 1810. Anne Hasseltine was 20 years old, beautiful, vivacious, a woman whose natural exuberance had already been disciplined by genuine conversion. She had wrestled with God and found Christ at 16. She loved him deeply. And she was not afraid. Judson wrote to her father, John Hasseltine, asking for Anne's hand in one of the most extraordinary letters ever written in the history of missions. He did not try to conceal what he was asking the man to surrender. He wrote plainly, "I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world? Whether you can consent to her departure to a heathen land, and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life. Whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all this, in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory, with a crown of righteousness brightened by the acclamations of praise which shall redound to her Savior from heathens saved, through her means, from eternal woe and despair?" Anne's father gave his consent, and herself never hesitated. On February 5, 1812, they were married at Bradford. On February 6, Judson received his ordination at Salem. On February 19, the young couple sailed from Salem Harbor on the brig Caravan, bound for Calcutta. They were going to Burma, though at that point they did not yet know it, to preach the gospel to people who had never heard the name of Jesus. They were 23 and 22 years old. The voyage changed something. Aboard the ship, with months of ocean travel stretching before him, Judson began studying the New Testament with intense focus, specifically the question of baptism. He expected, as a good Congregationalist, to defend the practice of infant baptism when he met the Baptist missionaries in Calcutta. So he opened the Greek and studied, and studied, and studied. He did not find what he was looking for. After months of searching, both he and Anne were forced, reluctantly, painfully, at great cost to themselves, to conclude that believers' baptism by immersion was what Scripture taught. This was not a small thing. It meant separating from the mission board that was paying their way. It meant leaving their fellow missionaries. It meant arriving in a foreign land with no support and no denomination behind them. It meant financial ruin and perhaps starvation. But Adoniram Judson was not the kind of man who could discover what he believed to be true and hide it for convenience. He wrote to the American Board, the very organization he had helped found, and resigned. He wrote to the Baptists of America, scattered, small, largely unknown, and effectively said, "I am yours if you will have me." The American Baptist Missionary Union was born from that letter. Again, out of one man's obedience, a stream flowed into the nations. The Judsons arrived in Rangoon, Burma, on July 13, 1813. If there is one word for what greeted them, it is desolation. Rangoon was a filthy, dangerous town of 8 to 10,000 people, built of bamboo and teak, cut by muddy creeks. The Burman Empire was ruled by an absolute despot in Ava whose life or death decisions were made at a nod. The religion was Buddhism, ancient, entrenched, philosophically elaborate, and bitterly hostile to any new teaching. The language was unlike anything Judson had ever encountered, monosyllabic, tonal, written in a flowing script on dried palm leaves, with no English dictionary, no reliable grammar, no English-speaking teacher. There was also, in all of Burma, not a single Christian convert. Judson began to study. He sat across from a Burman teacher for hours every day, drilling, repeating, reading, translating, and learned the language faster in conversation. He learned it more deeply in structure. They both gave themselves to it completely. A year passed. No converts. 2 years. No converts. 3 years. No converts. Letters came from America asking for results. Letters came from missionary supporters asking when the blessing would come. Judson wrote back with defiant patience. "If they ask what success I meet with, tell them to look at Bengal, where Dr. Thomas labored 17 years before the first convert, Krishna, was baptized. If they ask what prospect of ultimate success there is, tell them, as much as there is an almighty and faithful God who will perform his promises." He kept studying. He kept translating. He began building a zayat, a small wayside pavilion where Buddhist teachers traditionally sat and discussed philosophy with anyone who passed. He would sit in his zayat and engage whoever came. He preached to individuals, face to face, with the burning logic of a man who had given up everything for this one thing. The local viceroy was a savage man. The death penalty hung over any Burman who renounced Buddhism. The price of following Christ was potentially everything. And still, the Spirit began to move. On June 27, 1819, 6 long years after their arrival, Adoniram Judson led the first Burman convert into the waters of baptism. His name was Mung Now. The moment was electric. In all those centuries, no one had planted a church among the Burmans. Now there was one. Others followed. A man named Mung Shwanong, a brilliant skeptic who had been wrestling with Judson's arguments for years, came to faith. Then others. The little church of 3 grew to 5, to 8. And on a night by lantern light, Judson baptized the 10th Burman convert, the first woman ever baptized in Burma. Her name was Mamenla. She was 51 years old and one of the most respected women in her community. She had come to Judson late at night after watching her teacher baptized earlier that evening, and she could not wait. "Now I have taken the oath of allegiance to Jesus Christ," she said when she came up from the water. "I have nothing to do but commit myself, soul and body, into the hands of my Lord, assured that he will never suffer me to fall away." Judson wept. But the darkness was gathering. In December of 1823, Judson made a third journey to Ava, the capital of the Burman Empire, this time with his wife, hoping to establish a permanent mission station in the heart of the nation. They had barely unpacked their things when the world fell apart. War broke out between the Burman Empire and the British East India Company. Rangoon fell. And in Ava, the paranoid Burman government looked at every white foreigner and saw a spy. On the morning of June 8, 1824, as the Judsons finished worship at a neighbor's house, a messenger came. The king had sent for the teacher. Within minutes, the spotted man, the executioner, was at their door. What happened in those moments is almost impossible to imagine. And threw herself at the man, trying to buy her husband's freedom with silver. Judson was dragged onto the floor, his wrists bound with a small cord that cut through flesh. The neighbors gathered in horror. The children screamed. And the executioner, laughing, drew the ropes tighter and tighter until Judson could barely breathe, then hauled him out the door. And ran after him. She watched from a distance as the ropes were tightened still further in the street. Then the death prison door closed, and her husband was gone. The death prison of Ava was a place designed for one purpose: to break human beings. The building had never been swept or washed since the day it was built. The floor was saturated with the accumulation of years, refuse, insect colonies, the waste of hundreds of prisoners living in unimaginable squalor. The temperature inside reached 100 degrees. The air was almost solid with pestilence. Judson was thrown in with the other foreign prisoners and placed in 5 pairs of iron fetters, iron rings around his ankles connected by chains so short he could barely shuffle a step at a time. The weight of the irons alone was 14 pounds. At nightfall, the prisoners were strung on a bamboo pole, their legs hoisted in the air while their shoulders rested on the filthy ground, until morning. He lay in that prison for 21 months. What sustained him was not stoic endurance. It was not Eastern detachment. It was the same faith that had driven him from Plymouth to Andover, from America to Burma, from comfort to consecration. In the worst hours, he wrote out the Lord's Prayer in Burman verse. He murmured the beautiful words of Madame Guyon, "No place I seek, but to fulfill in life and death thy lovely will." He prayed. He preached quietly to the other prisoners. A fellow captive later wrote, "He expressed to me such sentiments as these: Here have I been 10 years preaching the gospel to timid listeners. And now God opens the way by leading a Christian nation to subdue the country. It is possible that my life may be spared. If so, with what ardor shall I pursue my work? And if not, the door will be opened for others who will do the work better." Outside those walls, his wife was doing something that has no equal in the history of missions. And Hasseltine Judson, sick, terrified, alone with a newborn baby, fought for her husband's life with everything she had. Day after day, week after week, month after month, she visited Burman officials, bribing them, pleading with them, presenting petitions to the king's court. She was turned away dozens of times. She wept. She prayed. She tried again. She brought food to the prison twice a day, walking 2 miles each way in the blazing heat. She built a tiny bamboo shelter near the prison walls to be closer to her husband. When officials threatened her, she stood her ground. When they demanded silver, she gave it. When they demanded she confess to things that were not true, she said, in the words of a woman who knew exactly what she believed, "I cannot tell a falsehood. My religion forbids it. And had you stood by me with a knife raised, I could not have said what you suggest." In January of 1825, while Judson was still in chains, and gave birth to their daughter, Maria, a baby born in the shadow of the death prison. When the prisoners were moved suddenly in May to a place called Umpenla, a dilapidated country prison miles away, they were marched through the burning midday sun with their feet unshod on ground like hot coals. Judson was already weakened by fever. By the midpoint of the march, the soles of his feet were completely raw. He could barely move. A fellow prisoner offered his shoulder. A servant tore off his headdress and wrapped half of it around Judson's bleeding feet. A Greek prisoner in the group collapsed from the heat and died on the road. Judson survived, barely, at Umpenla, and followed her husband, arriving that very evening with baby Maria in her arms, having traveled for hours in a cart so rough it nearly shook her apart. She found the prisoners chained under the open sky, the prison building roofless, the fence destroyed. Her husband looked at her and said only, "Why have you come? I hoped you would not follow, for you cannot live here." She stayed in that miserable compound over the next 6 months, and nursed her husband through fever, inoculated the prison children and their families against smallpox, stretched every coin they had to buy food when there was no market nearby, and kept both her husband and her infant daughter alive through sheer force of love and prayer. When she herself was struck by spotted fever, a disease almost always fatal to foreigners, her Burman nurse said, "She is dead. And if the King of Angels should come in, he could not recover her." She recovered. And on February 21, 1826, after 21 months of imprisonment, Adoniram Judson was released. The war had ended. A treaty of peace was signed. The British and Burmese had agreed to terms. He was free. But freedom is not always the end of the suffering. Sometimes it is the beginning of the deepest grief. Judson was sent to the British camp to serve as an interpreter during the peace negotiations. While he was gone, Anne's health, shattered by years of imprisonment, malnutrition, and sickness, finally gave way. On October 24, 1826, at the age of 37, Anne Hasseltine Judson died of fever at a mission outpost called Amherst. She had not seen her husband for months. Her last words were, "The teacher is long in coming. I am not afraid of death, but I am afraid I shall not be able to bear these pains. Tell the teacher how I suffered and died. Tell him everything." She was buried beneath a hopia tree. 6 months later, little Maria, the baby born in the shadow of the death prison, the child of so much pain and prayer, died too. She was 2 years and 3 months old. They laid her beside her mother. Judson stood at their graves and wrote, "I am left alone in the wide world. My own dear family I have buried, 1 in Rangoon and 2 in Amherst. What remains for me but to hold myself in readiness to follow the dear departed to that blessed world, where my best friends, my kindred dwell, where God, my Savior, reigns." He was 38 years old. What does a man do after that? After 6 years of no converts? After prison and torture? After the death of a wife who was his closest companion in the work? After the death of the child they had both loved so fiercely? What does a man do? He went back to work. Not with the cheerful resilience of someone who has not been broken. He was broken. He passed through a dark valley of the soul, a period he called Gaianism, after the writings of the French mystic Madame Guyon, where he stripped himself of everything. He gave all his private savings to the mission board. He declined honorary degrees and destroyed his correspondence, wanting no biographies, no fame, no monuments. He said, "I feel that I am a worm and no man. It is a wonder that I am allowed to live as a missionary among the heathen." But beneath the grief, the fire was still burning. He translated the Old Testament. He revised the New. He wrote catechisms. He preached. He baptized converts in the Zayat. He carried the gospel into the wild Karen jungles, trekking for days through rivers and over mountains and through tiger country, sleeping on bare bamboo, preaching to village after village of simple forest dwellers who had never heard the name of God. The Karens had an ancient tradition that white messengers from across the sea would one day come and teach them the truth. When the gospel arrived among them, it was like fire in dry grass. They came to faith by the hundreds. They were baptized. They planted churches. They endured persecution from Buddhist priests and hostile villagers. They held fast. By 1831, the little church of 10 converts that had trembled in Rangoon a decade earlier had become a movement spanning hundreds of miles of jungle and coastline. Judson baptized the 100th member of the church at Maulmain on September 8, 1833. Then the 200th. Then 300. He also fell in love again. After several years of widowhood and sorrow, he married Sarah Hall Boardman, the widow of George Boardman, his fellow missionary who had died heroically in the Karen jungles with his boots on. Sarah was a woman of the same caliber as Anne. She had carried on her first husband's work in Tavoe after his death, refusing to leave the field, continuing to preach and teach and baptize. She and Judson worked together in deep mutual respect and affection for 11 years. She bore him several children. She was his companion through the years of greatest literary achievement. It was in those years that Judson completed perhaps the greatest single achievement of his life, the translation of the entire Bible into Burmese. To understand what this meant, you have to understand what the Burmese language is. It is one of the most difficult languages on earth for a Western mind. The script flows in curves without breaks between words. What looks like one long flowing word is actually a whole paragraph. The grammar runs on structures so unlike European thought that Judson once wrote that after 2 years of study, his Burmese was still less fluent than his French after 2 months. There was no dictionary. There was no guide. He had to build the language from scratch, one palm leaf at a time. He completed the New Testament in 1823. He finished the Old Testament in 1834. The complete Burmese Bible, every word translated, revised, polished, was the work of decades of his life. A scholar reviewing his work wrote, "So completely was Judson master of this very difficult tongue, and of the modes of thought of its people, that he could impart to an inquirer intense satisfaction, and force a subtle Buddhist philosopher to yield to the skill of a foreign disputant." The Burmese Bible still stands. It has never been replaced. Generations of Burman and Karen Christians have held it in their hands, and they know whose hands first held it. In 1845, after 33 years in Burma, Judson was brought home. His health was destroyed. His voice was nearly gone. He came back to the America of his childhood, the country that had commissioned him and prayed for him and was now receiving him as a man of legendary stature. But what struck everyone who met him was not the legend. It was the humility. In Boston, when a crowd gathered at a missionary convention, someone tried to introduce him from the platform. He stopped the speaker. "My physicians have forbidden me to speak. But I must say a few words. I must protest against the abandonment of the Arakan mission. If the convention thinks my services can be dispensed with in finishing my dictionary, I will go immediately to Arakan and labor there and die and be buried there." The crowd was silent. Then they erupted. The Arakan mission was saved. He visited the birthplace of his beloved and in Bradford. He visited the churches that had supported the mission with their small gifts. He wept with old friends. He preached in a broken whisper. And in Philadelphia, at the house of a Christian physician, he met a young woman who had been writing brilliant fiction under the pen name Fanny Forrester. Her real name was Emily Chubbuck. She was 28 years old, poor, gifted, and secretly tormented by a conviction she had carried since childhood that she was meant to be a missionary. She had read the memoir of an Hasseltine Judson as a little girl and never recovered. Within months, against the protests of the literary world who thought the brilliant Fanny Forrester was throwing herself away on an old missionary, and against the protests of the religious world who thought the missionary enterprise was compromised by an alliance with a fiction writer, Adoniram Judson and Emily Chubbuck were married in Hamilton, New York, on June 2, 1846. He was 57. She was 28. Less than 6 weeks later, they sailed. Before he boarded the ship, he wrote to his sons, *, "Farewell. We embark tomorrow about noon. Many a time I shall look at your likenesses and weep over them, and pray that you may early become true Christians. He never saw them again. Back in Burma, the final years were years of quiet, determined, agonizing labor. The dictionary, the great Burmese dictionary, the other monument of his life alongside the Bible, consumed him. Every morning, rising at dawn, he sat at his desk and defined words. Every evening he lay down with the task unfinished. He could not work fast enough. His health was crumbling. His lungs were going. Emily, watching him from across the room, wrote poetry about what she saw. A man burning himself down to nothing for a language he loved because a people he loved needed to read God's word in it. In January of 1849, he finished the English and Burmese portion of the dictionary. He was working on the Burmese and English half when his body finally gave out. In April of 1850, his physicians told him that his only hope was a sea voyage. The ocean air might revive him. On April 3rd, he was carried aboard a French bark called the Arts Ride Marie, too weak to stand without help. His Burman assistants, Ko En and Ko Shui Dok, disciples of many years, stood weeping on the deck. They begged to have him brought back to shore, to be buried where they could visit his grave. He would not allow it. The ship sailed. Emily could not go with him. She stood on the shore of Malmain and watched the ship disappear into the Indian Ocean. 9 days later, on April 12, 1850, at 15 minutes past 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in latitude 13 degrees north, longitude 93 degrees east, 3 days out of sight of the mountains of Burma, Adoniram Judson breathed his last. His fellow traveler, Mr. Rani, wrote, his death was like falling asleep. Not the movement of a muscle was perceptible. The moment of the going out of life was indicated only by his ceasing to breathe. A gentle feeble pressure of the hand, growing more and more feeble as life waned, showed the peacefulness of the spirit about to take its homeward flight. They built him a coffin of strong planks, weighed it with buckets of sand, and at 8 o'clock that evening, in perfect silence broken only by the voice of the French captain, they opened the larboard port of the ship and committed all that was mortal of Adoniram Judson to the deep. The ocean is his grave. The ocean which visits every shore. The ocean which touches every coast. He did not know he was leaving behind 63 churches among the Burmans and Karens. He did not know there were over 7,000 baptized converts in the field he had entered alone, with nothing but a lexicon and a Bible and an absolute conviction that God keeps his promises. He did not know that within a generation, the Burman mission he had planted would multiply to thousands of churches. He did not know that the Burmese Bible he translated would still be read by millions over a century and a half later, unchanged because no one could improve it. He did not know. He only knew that he had been called. And he had obeyed. The marble tablet they placed for him in Maiden, Massachusetts, his birthplace, reads, born August 9, 1788. Died April 12, 1850. Malden, his birthplace. The ocean, his sepulchre. Converted Burmans and the Burman Bible, his monument. His record is on high. What do you do with a life like this? Not every Christian is called to Burma. Not every follower of Jesus will face a death prison or watch a spouse die on the mission field. Most of us will live ordinary lives in ordinary places, and God is not asking us to fabricate dramatic sacrifices to prove we love Him. But Adoniram Judson confronts us with a question that cuts through every excuse, every comfort, every negotiation we make with the smallness of our own obedience. He asked himself, in the darkest hours of his imprisonment, is God enough? And the answer that came back, through years and losses and a broken body and a grave in the sea, was yes. Not a triumphant yes. Not a comfortable yes. The yes of a man who clung to the promises of God with bleeding hands and refused to let go. This is what he told the students at Hamilton, New York, in one of his last public addresses in America. Brethren, look to Jesus. This sight will fill you with the greatest consolation and delight. So great is his love that, if he had 1,000 lives, he would lay them all down for your redemption. Look to him in affliction. He will strengthen you. Look to him in temptation. He will succor you. Look to him in death. He will sustain you. Look to him in the judgment. He will save you. The man who spent 37 years in the furnace was not preaching theory. He was preaching from memory. And after all those years, after all that loss, after everything the enemy threw at him, what did he say when a fellow traveler in his final days asked if he felt that Christ was near? He opened his eyes. He smiled. It is all right there. I believe he gives me just so much pain and suffering as is necessary to fit me to die. If this story has stirred something in you today, something like fire, something like conviction, something that makes you want to live differently, then this is your moment. You don't have to go to Burma. But you do have to decide what your life is for. And if somewhere in this story you recognize that you've been far from God, that you've been running from the one who gave everything for you, you don't have to wait until tomorrow. You don't have to clean yourself up first. You don't have to have it all figured out. Right now, where you're sitting, you can speak to God. He is as near to you as he was to Adoniram Judson in the death prison, near enough to be called upon, faithful enough to answer, strong enough to hold you no matter what lies ahead. If you've been walking with Jesus and this story has rekindled something in you, fan it into flame. Obey the thing you've been postponing. Say yes to the thing you've been afraid of. If you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it. You never know whose Buchanan sermon moment it might be. You never know whose woods behind and over walk you might set in motion. And if this channel has been a place where God has spoken to you, subscribe. There are more of these stories waiting, men and women who gave everything for the gospel, whose lives are still speaking, whose faith still stirs revival in hearts like yours. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know, from Maulmain to Massachusetts, from Lagos to London, that the God of Adoniram Judson is still building his church, still calling his people, and still faithful to every promise he has made. The ocean is his grave. But his king is risen, and his record is on high.